The worship of Adonis in Phoenicia is considered one of the most prominent religious and cultural manifestations that flourished on the Mediterranean coasts, where the Phoenicians' deep vision of the cycle of life, death, and revival was embodied. And this worship was linked to the myth of Adonis, the young god who symbolizes beauty, fertility, and renewal, and who was celebrated through seasonal rituals reflecting the natural transformations between spring and autumn, forming a symbolic expression of the eternal struggle between life and death. The worship of Adonis was not limited to the religious aspect only, but its influence extended to art, literature, and cultural relations with neighboring civilizations, making it a primary pillar in Phoenicia's Mediterranean heritage. To know more details, follow us until the end, and do not forget to support us through liking the video and subscribing to the channel so that everything new reaches you. Adonis is one of the most prominent gods in Phoenician mythology, and he represents an embodiment of the idea of death, resurrection, and fertility. His original name in the Phoenician language is Adon, meaning the Lord, or the Master, which is a title used later in different languages and religions. With the passage of time, his myth moved to neighboring cultures, especially the Greek culture, where it was reshaped within the framework of Greek myths under the name Adonis. And the worship of Adonis was rooted in Phoenicia as one of the most prominent religious and cultural expressions that formed the identity of this Mediterranean coastal people. The origin of this worship goes back to the myth of Adonis, the young god who embodies beauty, fertility, and renewal, and whose story was linked to the cycle of life and death that reflected the Phoenicians' vision of nature and its transformations. According to the myth, Adonis was born from a forbidden relationship between Myrrha, or Smyrna, and her father, which sparked the anger of the gods. So Myrrha transformed into the myrrh tree that later split for Adonis to emerge from it, as if it were a birth from nature itself. And this supernatural birth earned Adonis a legendary character, making him a symbol of divine beauty that attracts even the great gods. And the myth centers around the love of Ishtar, or Astarte in the Phoenician context, for Adonis, and her struggle with the god of the underworld to possess him. It is told that Adonis was killed during hunting by a wild boar, which is the event that represents his tragic death, and the bleeding of his blood on the ground produced the red anemone flower as a symbol of short life and fleeting beauty. But the myth does not end with death, as Ishtar intervenes to recover him from the underworld, leading to an agreement stipulating that Adonis spends part of the year with her in the upper world and another part in the underworld. And this cycle between life and death made Adonis a symbol of seasonal renewal, closely linked to spring, where nature returns to life, and autumn, where it withers. And the symbolism in the worship of Adonis transcends the religious aspect to philosophical and cultural dimensions. Adonis represents the beauty that does not last, and the life that is subject to the laws of vanishing and renewal. This symbolism made his worship attractive not only to the Phoenicians, but also to neighboring peoples, where similar rituals spread in Greece under the name Adonis, and in Rome as a god linked to fertility and spring. And the worship of Adonis was influenced by the cultural interactions between Phoenicia and neighboring civilizations, such as Mesopotamia and Egypt, where his story resembled other myths such as Tammuz and Osiris. This overlap reflects the nature of Phoenicia as a commercial and cultural center linking the East and the West. Through the ships that sailed from the ports of Tyre and Sidon, this myth and its rituals moved to all parts of the Mediterranean, making Adonis a global symbol of the eternal cycle of life and death. With this, the worship of Adonis was not just a religious practice, but rather an expression of a Phoenician vision of the world, combining beauty, loss, and hope in renewal. The rituals of death used to begin with deep sadness over Adonis, who is told to have been brutally killed by a wild boar during hunting. And this event, saturated with symbolism, used to revive in the celebrants a sense of loss, as the death of Adonis is looked upon as a necessary sacrifice to ensure the fertility of the earth. In Byblos, women used to play a central role in these rituals, as they would weep for Adonis in collective celebrations, expressing collective grief. And the weeping was accompanied by funeral hymns and symbolic practices, such as planting the gardens of Adonis, which are small pots in which seeds are planted that sprout quickly and then wither, to reflect the short life of Adonis and his fleeting beauty. And afterwards, the women would throw the withered pots into the sea or rivers as part of the ritual, as a symbol of releasing Adonis from the underworld and receiving him in the upper world. And these gardens were not just a symbol of death, but they reflected the idea of sacrifice, as the celebrants would invest effort in planting something they know will vanish, which reinforces the sense of spiritual connection to the cycle of nature. But the rituals of death were not the end of the spiritual journey, for after the sadness, the stage of revival used to come, which celebrates the return of Adonis from the underworld. And this return, which was closely linked to spring, represented the victory of life over death and the renewal of nature after a long winter. And the celebrations of revival were full of joy, as the celebrants used to dance and sing, expressing their happiness at the return of fertility and life to the earth. And this cycle between sadness and joy reflected a deep Phoenician vision of the balance between loss and hope, where death is viewed not as an end, but as part of a continuous process of renewal. And the rituals of Adonis were not limited to the spiritual aspect, but they were also a social occasion that strengthened the bonds between the members of society. And in Phoenician cities such as Tyre and Sidon, the celebrations used to gather people from different classes, as everyone participated in sadness and joy together. Also, these rituals included artistic and musical performances, which made them a rich cultural expression. And the influence of these rituals extended to what is beyond Phoenicia, as they moved to the Greek and Roman civilizations, where similar rituals appeared in the Dionysian festivals. Thus, the worship of Adonis became a bridge between Eastern and Western mythology, and its influence was manifested in literature, art, religion, and even in philosophy that contemplated the meaning of annihilation and resurrection, and love and death. In Byblos, which was considered the spiritual capital of the worship of Adonis, the temple dedicated to him was a primary center for celebrations. It is told that this temple was located near the Adonis River, known today as the Ibrahim River, whose waters were seasonally linked to the blood of the mythical Adonis, which gave the place a sacred character. And the performance of rituals was not limited to the temple itself, but rather they extended to the surrounding areas, where the river and the nearby mountains were part of the spiritual scene. And in Tyre and Sidon, the temples of Adonis, even if they were not documented with the same fame that Byblos enjoyed, played a similar role in strengthening social and religious bonds. And these temples were often part of larger religious complexes, including places dedicated to other deities such as Astarte, who was closely linked to Adonis in the myth. And these temples were carefully designed to reflect natural symbolism, with the presence of open spaces for collective celebrations and closed places for the secret rituals performed by the priests. Also, they contained altars for presenting offerings, which often included flowers and plants, reflecting the connection with fertility and renewal. And these temples were not just religious centers, but they were also cultural and commercial centers. Thanks to their location on the coasts, they used to attract traders and travelers from different parts of the Mediterranean, which contributed to spreading the worship of Adonis to farther regions, such as Cyprus and Greece. And this cultural interaction made the temples intersection points between Phoenician traditions and neighboring civilizations. Despite the religious and spiritual character that distinguishes the rituals of the worship of Adonis, they have an economic aspect that is no less important, as the seasonal rituals used to transform into economic occasions that move wide sectors of society. For the mourning and revival rituals specific to Adonis were held in specific seasons, and they were often accompanied by seasonal markets promoting goods related to the celebration, such as flowers, pottery vessels, fabrics, perfumes, and small statues representing the god. and these products were sold in large quantities to pilgrims and participants in the rituals, which created important commercial opportunities for local traders and visitors alike. Also, the religious processions and celebrations that last for several days required wide logistical organization, providing food, lodging, decorations, and public services. This created seasonal job opportunities and raised the demand for labor in diverse sectors. For the temples themselves were considered economic centers, as they used to collect donations and offerings and manage the agricultural and commercial endowments, awqaf, linked to them. In many cases, the money collected from the rituals was invested in projects that benefit the city, and the management of these temples was in the hands of trained priests, who often belonged to prominent families in the Phoenician cities. They used to supervise the rituals and organize the seasonal celebrations, while ensuring the preservation of the traditions linked to the myth of Adonis. Also, women had a prominent role in these temples, for the role of women was not limited to participating in public rituals, but rather it extended to organizing them in some cases. And some women, especially from prominent families, used to take leadership roles in the temples, where they supervised the preparation of offerings and the coordination of celebrations. And this role strengthened their status in society, as the worship of Adonis granted women a space to express themselves outside the traditional social frameworks. Also, the association of women with Adonis and Astarte, the goddess who accompanied him in the myth, reflected the cultural appreciation of femininity as a creative and life-preserving force. The worship of Adonis in Phoenicia was not merely a religious ritual or a symbolic practice linked to death and resurrection, but rather it also carried deep political and social dimensions, reflecting the nature of Phoenician societies and the role of religion in consolidating power and order. In Phoenician cities such as Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, political power was often linked to religious institutions, for the priests and the high priest enjoyed strong influence, and in some cases they were part of the ruling class or close to it. And through controlling the rituals of the worship of Adonis and organizing them, the political elites were able to employ religion as a tool to regulate social behavior and enhance prestige and legitimacy. The seasonal celebrations specific to the death of Adonis and his return were an opportunity for the authorities to show power and organization through funding the processions, presenting offerings, and organizing public celebrations. This political involvement in the rituals was not random, but rather it carried an implicit message to the effect that the ruler or the ruling class maintains the relationship with the gods and ensures the continuity of fertility and prosperity in society. Also, the association of Adonis with the goddess Astarte, who was also worshipped as a goddess of war, opens the door to another political interpretation, represented in that the myth was reflecting power struggles and their balance, not only in heaven, but also on earth. As the death of Adonis and the return of life through the intervention of Astarte can be read as a symbol of the cycle of power and its rise and fall. The worship of Adonis, the Phoenician god linked to fertility, death, and resurrection, witnessed a wide spread in the regions of Phoenicia, and yet this worship was not isolated from the major political and religious transformations witnessed by the region, especially with the beginnings of the Roman era and the emergence of monotheistic religions. By the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the features of change began to appear clearly. For with the increasing influence of the Roman Empire, pagan religions, including the worship of Adonis, began to be exposed to increasing pressures, whether from the authorities or from new intellectual and religious currents. And with the entry of Christianity into the Levant and its spread in Phoenician cities, the ancient worships began to decline before the new Christian concepts that rejected pagan rituals, especially those linked to fertility and sacred sexual practices. The transformation was not merely a religious matter, but was also cultural and social, for societies began to adopt Christian values, and pagan temples were converted into churches, or were abandoned entirely. And the public rituals of mourning for Adonis, and the celebrations of his return, which used to be held in spring, declined until they gradually vanished. and remained only as symbols in the folk memory or as artistic and literary themes in the later era. Despite that, some traces indicative of this worship remained, such as the Ibrahim River, the Adonis River anciently, witnessing the story of a god who was one day embodying life and death. But he too was subject to the fate of vanishing, as everything human does in the face of time. In conclusion, the worship of Adonis in Phoenicia, with its rituals that combine death and revival, was more than just a religious practice. It formed a deep expression of the Phoenicians' vision of life as a continuous cycle of vanishing and renewal. And the worship of Adonis remains a witness to a rich Phoenician legacy, where a philosophy of life celebrating renewal and continuity was embodied in its rituals, confirming that life, even in moments of loss, always carries a promise of return. Until here, we have reached the end of the talk, so do not forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button, and see you in a new documentary.